good is the river? We'll all die of thirst. No pubs!" It's better to let Harris go on shouting when he gets angry. Then he gets tired, and he's quiet afterwards. I reminded him that we had water in the boat. Then he started shouting about water. He said drinks like that made people ill. However, he said that he must drink something. He climbed onto the seat, and he bent down to get the bottle out of the basket. It was at the bottom, and he had to bend down lower and lower. At the same time, he was trying to steer the boat, and he pulled the wrong rope. The boat turned sharply and bumped into the bank of the river, and Harris fell into the basket. He stood there on his head, and he held on to the side of the boat. His legs were in the air. He could not move in case he fell over. He had to stay there until I could catch his legs and pull him back, and that made him more angry. We stopped under the trees by Kempton Park, and we had lunch. It is very pretty there, on the grass by the river, under the trees. We had an excellent meal, and Harris calmed down and began to enjoy himself again. By 3:30, we had reached Sunbury Lock. Then we went up to Walton, which is quite an interesting place. Julius Caesar stayed there with his soldiers. Queen Elizabeth I, she was there too. You can never get away from that woman. She was everywhere. Next we came to Halliford and Shepperton. There is an old church at Shepperton, and I was worried in case Harris wanted to go and visit it. I saw him looking towards it as we came near, but I moved the boat quickly, and Harris's cap fell into the water. We had to get it back, of course. Luckily, he was very angry with me, and so he forgot about his church. As we came up to the lock at Weybridge, we saw something brightly coloured on one of the lock gates. When we looked closer, we saw that it was George. Montmorency started to bark madly. I shouted, and Harris called out wildly. George waved his cap and yelled back to us. The lock-keeper ran out, because he thought someone had fallen in the water. He seemed annoyed when he saw that no one had fallen in. Chapter 8. George starts work. We decided that now George was there, he was going to do some work. He did not want to work, of course. "I've had a bad day at the bank," he explained. Harris, who is sometimes a little cruel, said, "Ah, and now you're going to have a bad time on the river for a change. A change is good for you. Come on, get out of the boat and tow." George could not refuse, really, but he did say, "Perhaps it would be better if I stayed in the boat and prepared the meal. You two can tow the boat." Then he added, "It's very difficult to prepare a meal, and you both look tired." Our only reply was to give him the rope. So he started walking, and he pulled the boat behind him. Sometimes people forget that they are towing a boat, and later George told us a story about this. George had once seen a man and a young lady who were walking by the side of the river. They were pulling a rope behind them, and they were talking to each other. They did not notice that there was no boat on the end of the rope. Of course, they probably had a boat on the end of the rope when they started out, but it had disappeared. The two young people were not worried about this. They had their rope. They did not seem to care that there was no boat. George was going to call out to tell them about it. But just then he had an idea. he took hold of the rope, and he tied it to his own boat. Then he and his 3 fat, heavy friends sat in the back of their boat and lit their pipes. And that young man and young woman towed George and his friends up to Marlow. It was when they reached the lock that they looked back. Suddenly they understood that they had been towing the wrong boat. George said, "I've never seen anyone look as sad as those 2 young people then." The young man was a bit annoyed. In fact, he was probably going to say something angry to George and his friends. But just then, the young woman cried wildly, "Oh, Henry, then where's Aunt Mary?" "Did they ever get the old lady back?" Harris asked. George replied that he did not know. But the most exciting thing of all is to let girls tow your boat. Let me tell you about it. First of all, you need 3 girls. You always need 3 girls to tow a boat. 2 of them hold the rope, and the other one runs here and there and laughs all the time. They usually begin by tying themselves up in the rope. They get it round their legs, and then they have to sit down to untie it. Next they get it round their necks. When they finally get it right, they always start by running. They pull the boat much too fast. After a few minutes, they are tired, and so they stop suddenly. They all sit down on the grass and they start to laugh. Meanwhile, your boat goes out into the middle of the river and it starts to turn round. Then they stand up and are surprised. "Oh, look," they say, "the boat's gone into the middle of the river." After this, they pull you along quite well for a time. Then one of them decides to stop for something else. So the boat runs aground in shallow water near the river bank. You jump up, and you push the boat off into deep water. You shout to them, "Don't stop!" "Yes, what's the matter?" they shout back. "Don't stop!" you cry loudly. "Don't what?" "Don't stop! Go on! Go on!" "Go back, Emily, and see what they want," one of them says. And Emily comes back and asks, "What is it? Is anything wrong?" "No!" you shout. "It's all right, but go on! Don't stop!" "Why not?" "Because we can't steer the boat if you stop." "Why not?" "You must keep the boat moving." "Oh, all right. I'll tell them. Are we doing everything else all right?" "Oh, yes, very nicely, but don't stop." "I see. Oh, give me my hat, please. It's over there." You find her hat, and you give it to her. But then another girl comes. She thinks she will have her hat too. And then they take Mary's hat for her. Mary does not want it, so they bring it back. Then they want a comb. It is about 20 minutes before they start again. Then at the next corner they see a cow. You have to stop and leave the boat to chase the cow away. Anyway, this time it was George who towed us on to Penton Hook. There we discussed the important question of where to spend the night. We had decided to sleep on the boat. Therefore we could stay there, or we could go on past Staines. In the end, we decided to continue to Runnymede. Later, we all wished we had stopped at Penton Hook. Chapter 9. our first night on the boat. After some time, Harris and I began to think that Bell Weir Lock had disappeared. "Perhaps someone has taken it away," we said. George had towed the boat as far as Staines, and we had towed it from there. It seemed to get heavier and heavier. We began to think that we were right and that someone had moved the lock. But finally, at 7:30, we reached it and got through it. By now, we just wanted to eat and to go to bed. So we stopped before we reached Magna Carta Island. It was quite a pretty place, and we tied our boat to a big tree. We were looking forward to having something to eat then, but George said,
"No, it's better to put the cover on the boat first, before it gets too dark. All our work will be finished then. We'll be able to sit down and enjoy our meal."
None of us had realized that it would be so difficult to fix the cover. There were 5 pieces of metal, and you put these into special holes on the side of the boat. The pieces of metal were half circles, and when you had put them into the holes, you just had to pull the cover over them. We thought it would probably take about 10 minutes. We were wrong. We took the pieces of metal, and we began to drop them into their holes. You would not expect this to be dangerous work, but it was. First of all, the pieces of metal would not fit into their holes. We had to jump on them, and kick them, and beat them. And when we got one in, we found that it was the wrong piece of metal for those holes, so we had to take it out again. At last we got them finished. Then we only had to put the cover on. George took one end, and he fastened it over the front of the boat. Harris stood in the middle of the boat to take the cover from George. I stayed at the back of the boat to take the end of the cover from Harris. George did his job all right, but it was new work to Harris, and he did everything wrong. I do not know how he did it, and Harris himself could not explain it later. After 10 minutes of really hard work, he was inside the cover. He could not get out. He fought the cover hard and knocked George over. Then George got angry and he began to fight too. George could not get out of the cover either. At the time, I did not know anything about all this. I did not understand what was happening anyway. They had told Montmorency and me to stand and wait. So Montmorency and I stood there and waited. We could see that the cover was moving about quite violently. However, we thought that it was all necessary for the job. We did nothing because they had told us to wait. We also heard many bad words coming from under the cover. Montmorency and I decided that this was because the job was very difficult. We waited for some time, but everything seemed to get worse. Finally, George's head appeared over the side of the boat. It said,
"We can't breathe under here. Why don't you help us, you great stupid thing?"
So I went and helped them. Harris's face was nearly black, so I was just in time. It took another half an hour after that to fix the cover. And then we started to prepare supper. We needed some hot water to make tea, so we put the water on the stove at the front of the boat, and we went to the back. We pretended that we were not interested in the water at all. We wanted it to think that we did not care if it got hot or not. We began to get the other things out. That is the only way to get hot water on the river. If the water knows that you are waiting for it, it will never get hot. You have to go away and begin your meal without it. You must not look at it. Then you will soon hear it making a lot of noise because it wants to be made into tea. It is also a good idea to talk very loudly to each other. You must say that you do not want any tea, that you do not need any tea, and that you are not going to have any tea. You get very near the water, and you shout, "I don't want any tea, do you, George?" And George shouts back, "Oh no, I don't like tea, we'll have milk." This makes the water very angry, and it gets hot very fast. We did this, and when everything else was ready, the tea was ready too. Then we sat down to have supper. We really wanted that supper. We needed that supper. And for 35 minutes, nobody on the boat spoke. After supper, we sat and smiled at each other. We smiled at Montmorency too. We loved everybody. We sat back, we lit our pipes, and we began to talk. George told us about something very funny that happened to his father once. When he was young, George's father was travelling with a friend. One night they stopped at a little hotel. They spent the evening there with some other young men. After a very happy evening, they went to bed. It was late, and by that time they, George's father and George's father's friend, were feeling quite happy themselves. Anyway, they were going to sleep in the same room, but in different beds. When they got into the room, they dropped their light, which went out. So they had to undress and get into bed in the dark. They thought they were getting into separate beds. However, because they could not see, they both got into the same one. One of them got in with his head at the top of the bed. The other one got in on the other side of the bed. He lay with his feet by the first one's head. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then George's father said, "Joe?" "What's the matter, Tom?" Joe replied from the other end of the bed. "Why, there's a man in my bed," George's father said. "His feet are here, next to me." "Well, that's very strange, Tom," Joe answered, "but there's a man in my bed, too." "What are you going to do?" George's father asked. "Well, I'm going to throw him out," Joe replied. "So am I," George's father said bravely. There was a short fight, and then there were 2 heavy bangs on the floor. After a moment or two, a rather sad voice said, "I say, Tom." "Yes?" "How have you got on?" "Well, to tell the truth, my man's thrown me out." "My man's thrown me out too. I say, this isn't a very good hotel, is it?" At the end of George's story, Harris asked, "What was the name of the hotel?" "The Riverside," George replied. "Why?" "Ah, it isn't the same hotel, then," Harris answered. "What do you mean?" George asked. "Well, it's strange," Harris said, "but the same thing happened to my father once. I've often heard him tell the story." After that, we went to bed. But I slept very badly. Chapter 10. Our first morning. I woke up at 6 o'clock the next morning, and I found that George was awake too. We both tried to go to sleep again, but we could not. This was because we did not need to get up early. We could sleep for another 2 or 3 hours, but we both felt we would die if we tried to sleep for another 5 minutes. George said that the same thing had happened to him a few months before. He told me a story about it. At that time, George had rooms in the house of a lady called Mrs. Gippings. One evening, his watch stopped at 8:15. He did not realize this then. When he went to bed, he took off his watch, and he did not look at it. This happened in the winter, so it was dark in the mornings anyway. When George woke up, he looked at his watch. It was 8:15.
"Good heavens!" George cried. "I have to be at the bank by 9 o'clock."
And he threw down the watch and jumped out of bed. He had a cold bath, and he dressed. Then he ran and looked at his watch. It had started to go again, and it was 9:20. George took his watch and ran downstairs. The dining room was dark and silent. There was no fire, no breakfast. George was very angry with Mrs. G. He decided to tell her this later in the evening. Then he caught hold of his coat, his hat, and his umbrella, and ran to the front door. It was locked. George said that Mrs. G was a lazy old woman. Then he unlocked the door and ran out into the street. For a few 100 meters he ran as fast as he could. But suddenly he noticed that there were not many people about. He also noticed that the shops were not open. It was a very dark and foggy morning. However, it seemed very strange that they had closed the shops because of the fog. He had to go to work, so why should other people stay in bed? George could see only 3 people. One of them was a policeman, one was a man who was taking vegetables to the market, and one was a taxi driver. George looked at his watch. It was 9:05. For a moment, he stood there without moving. He wondered if he was dreaming. He felt his wrist, and bent down and felt his legs. Then, with his watch in his hand, he went up to the policeman.
"What time is it, please?"
he asked the policeman.
"What's the time?" the policeman repeated. "Well, listen."
Just then, George heard a clock. 1, 2, 3.
"But that's only 3 times," George said when it had finished.
"Well, how many times do you want?" the policeman replied.
"Why, 9, of course,"
George said, and he held out his watch to the policeman. "Do you know where you live?" the policeman asked. George thought for a minute, and then he told the policeman the address. "Well, I think you should go back there quietly," the policeman continued, "and take your watch with you." So George went back. At first, he thought he would go to bed again. However, he did not like the idea of having to get up again later. So he decided to go to sleep in the armchair. But he could not get to sleep. He tried to read, but that was no good either. Finally, he put on his coat again, and he went out for a walk. He felt very lonely and miserable. He met policemen who looked at him strangely. They followed him about. He began to feel that he really had done something wrong. He started to hide in dark corners whenever he saw a policeman. Of course, then the policeman wanted to know what he was doing.
George said, "Nothing. I'm just going for a walk."
But they did not believe him. In the end, 2 policemen went back to the house with him. They wanted to know if he really did live there. They watched him go in with his key. Then they stood on the opposite side of the road and they watched the house. When he got in, he thought,
"I'll light the fire, and then I'll make some breakfast."
But he made a lot of noise, and he was afraid that Mrs. Gippings would wake up. She would hear the noise and think that he was a burglar. Then she would open the window and shout, "Help! Police!" The 2 policemen would come and arrest George and take him away. So he stopped trying to prepare breakfast, and he put on his coat. Then he sat in the armchair, and he waited for Mrs. Gippings. She came down at 7:30. George said that since then he had never got up too early again. When George had finished his story, we decided to wake up Harris. It was hard work. In the end, we had to use quite a sharp piece of metal. Harris sat up suddenly then. Montmorency had been asleep on Harris's chest, and he went flying across the boat. After that, we pulled up the cover, and we put our heads over the side of the boat. We looked down at the water. The night before, we had decided to get up early. We would throw off the cover, and we would jump into the water with shouts of happiness. Then we would enjoy a long swim. But now that morning had come, it did not seem to be a very good idea. The water looked wet and cold. The wind felt cold, too. "Well, who's going to go in for a swim first?" Harris said finally. Nobody hurried to be the first one. George put his head back inside the boat. Montmorency barked with horror at the idea. Harris said it would be difficult to climb back into the boat again from the water. Then he went back into the boat to look for his trousers. I did not want to give up the idea absolutely. I decided to go down to the edge of the river and then splash some water over myself. So I went out onto the river bank, and I began to move carefully along the branch of a tree which was over the water. It was very cold, and I thought I would not splash water over myself after all. I would go back into the boat and dress. I turned, and just then the stupid branch broke. The next minute, I was in the middle of the river, with 1/2 litre of the Thames inside me. "Good heavens! Old Jay's gone in," Harris said.
"Is it all right?"
George called out.
"Lovely,"
I replied.
"Why don't you come in?"
But they did not want to. When I got back to the boat, I was very cold. I wanted to put on my shirt as quickly as possible. By accident, I dropped it into the water. This made me very angry, but George started to laugh. "I can't see anything to laugh at," I told George. He just went on laughing. In fact, I never saw a man laugh so much. In the end, I became really angry with him. I told him what I thought about him. He laughed more loudly. And then, just as I was getting the shirt back out of the water, I noticed that it was not my shirt. So I began to laugh too. I looked at George, who was laughing so much. Then I looked at the wet shirt, and I laughed more and more. Because I was laughing so much, I dropped the shirt in the water again.
"Aren't you going to get it out?"
George cried between his shouts of laughter. At first I could not answer him, because I was laughing so much. In the end I managed to say, "It isn't my shirt. It's yours." I have never seen a man's face change so quickly. I tried to make him see that it was very funny, but he did not agree with me. After that it was time for breakfast, and we decided to have eggs. Harris said he would cook them. He said he was very good at doing eggs. People who had eaten his eggs never wanted any other food afterwards. "If they can't get my eggs, they won't eat," he said, "and they die." So we gave him the pan and all the eggs which had not broken. "Go on then," we said. "Begin." Harris had some trouble when he tried to break the eggs. He had trouble stopping them from getting onto his trousers, and he had more trouble trying to stop them from going up his arms. Finally, he managed to get about 6 of the eggs into the pan. Then he sat down and started to cook them. It seemed to be very difficult work. Whenever he went near the pan, he burnt himself. Then he dropped everything and danced about and waved his hands and shouted. In fact, every time George and I looked at him, he was doing this. At first we thought it was necessary to do this to cook the eggs. Once Montmorency went and looked into the pan, but he burnt himself. Then he started dancing and shouting too. It was all very exciting, and George and I were quite sorry when it finished. Chapter 11. Hotels and Tinned Fruit. After breakfast, I was sitting by the river and thinking, when George said,
"Perhaps, when you've rested enough, you could help to wash the plates and things."
So I cleaned the pan with some wood and grass, and George's wet shirt. Then we started to move up the river again, past Old Windsor, which is very pretty. After that, the river is not very interesting until you get to Bovany. George and I were towing the boat then. As we were passing Datchet, George asked me if I remembered our first trip up the river. On that trip, we reached Datchet at 10 o'clock at night. All we wanted to do was to eat and go to bed. I replied, "Yes, I do remember it. I remember it well. In fact, it will be some time before I forget it." It was one Saturday in August. There was George, and Harris and me. We were tired and hungry. When we got to Datchet, we took out of the boat the basket of food, the 2 bags, and the coats and things. Then we began to look for somewhere to stay. We passed a very pretty little hotel, but there were no roses round the door. I wanted somewhere with roses round the door. I do not know why. Anyway, I said, "Oh, we don't want to go there. Let's look for a little hotel with roses round the door." So we went on until we came to another hotel. That was a very nice one too, and it did have roses. But Harris did not like the man who was standing by the front door. Harris said that he did not look like a nice man, and he was wearing ugly boots. So we went on. We walked for some time, but we did not see any more hotels. Then we met a man, and we decided to ask him. "Excuse me, do you know any nice little hotels near here?" we said. "Well," he said, "you're coming away from them. Go back, and you'll come to the Black Horse." We said, "Oh, we've been there, and we didn't like it. There were no roses round the door." "Well then," he said, "there's the Traveller's Rest just beyond it. Have you tried that?" Harris replied that we did not want to go there. We did not like the man who was staying there. Harris did not like the colour of his hair. He did not like his boots either. "Well, I don't know what you're going to do then," the man answered, "because they are the only 2 hotels here." "No other hotels?" Harris cried. "None," the man replied. "What are we going to do now?" Harris asked. Then George spoke. He said,
"You two can ask someone to build you a hotel. I'm going back to the Black Horse."
So we went back to the Black Horse. "Good evening," the man at the desk said.
"Oh, good evening," George answered. "We want 3 beds, please."
"I'm sorry, sir,"
the man replied,
"but we haven't got 3 beds.
"Oh, well, it doesn't matter. 2 beds, then. 2 of us can sleep in 1 bed, can't we?" George continued. He looked at Harris and me.
Harris said, "Oh, yes." He thought that George and I could sleep in 1 bed very easily.
"I'm very sorry, sir,"
the man repeated.
"we haven't got any beds. We've already got 3 men in 1 bed."
We picked up our things, and we went over to the Traveller's Rest. It was a pretty little place. I said I thought it was better than the other hotel. Harris said it would be all right. We would not look at the man with red hair and ugly boots. The people at the Traveller's Rest did not wait to hear what we wanted. The lady at the desk said she had already sent away 14 people. There was no room of any kind. We asked her if she knew somewhere we could spend the night. She said there was a little house along the road. We did not wait. We picked up the basket, the bags and the coats, and we ran along the road. The people there laughed at us. There were only 3 beds in the house, and there were 7 men there already. Someone said,
"Why don't you try the little shop next to the Black Horse?"
So we went back along the road, but there were no beds at the little shop. However, there was an old lady in the shop. She said she had a friend who had some rooms. She added that she would take us there. The old woman walked very slowly, and it took us 20 minutes to get to her friend's house. During the walk, she told us about all the pains she had in her back. When we got there were already some people in her friend's rooms. From there we went to number 27. Number 27 was full. They sent us to number 32, and number 32 was full. Then we went back along the road. Suddenly, Harris sat down on the basket. He said he was not going to move. He added that it seemed to be nice and quiet there, and he said that he would like to die there. Just then, a little boy came past. "Do you know any old people that we can frighten so that they will give us their beds?" we asked him. "No, I don't," the boy answered. But he added that his mother would give us a room. And that was where we spent the night, in 2 very short beds. After that, we were never quite so difficult about hotels. On our present trip, though, nothing exciting happened. We continued slowly on our way, and we stopped for lunch near Monkey Island. We decided to have cold meat for lunch. Then after that, George brought out a tin of fruit. We loved tinned fruit, all 3 of us. We looked at the picture on the tin. We thought about the fruit. We imagined the taste of it. We smiled at each other, and Harris got out a spoon. Then we looked for the tin opener. We took everything out of the big basket. We took everything out of the bags. There was no tin opener. We pulled up the boards at the bottom of the boat. We put everything out on the grass by the river, and we shook everything. There was no tin opener. Then Harris tried to open the tin with a little knife, and he cut himself badly. George tried with some scissors. The scissors flew up and nearly hit him in the eye. I tried to make a hole in the tin with the sharp end of a piece of metal, but I missed. As a result, I fell in the water, and the tin flew away and broke a cup. Then we all got angry. We took that tin, and we put it on the grass by the river. Harris went into a field and got a big sharp stone. I got a long, thick piece of wood. George held the tin, and Harris put the sharp end of his stone against the top of it. I took the piece of wood and held it high in the air. Then I brought it down as hard as I could. It was George's hat that saved his life that day. He keeps that hat now. On a winter evening when men are telling stories about the dangers they have known, George brings out his hat. He shows it to his friends. Then he tells the story again, and he adds more details to it each time. Harris was not hurt too badly. After that, I took the tin away. I beat it until I was exhausted and miserable. Then Harris took it. We beat it until it was long and thin. We beat it until it was square. We hit it with the wood until it was every shape there is, but we could not make a hole in it. Then George tried, and he knocked it into a shape which was strange and terrible and ugly. It frightened him, and he threw away the piece of wood. Then the three of us sat round that tin on the grass, and we looked at it. There was one big line across the top of the tin that looked like a mouth. It seemed to be laughing at us, and this made us very angry. So Harris ran at it and picked it up. He threw it as hard as he could into the middle of the river. As it went down into the water, we shouted awful things at it. Then we got into the boat, and we left that place, and did not stop until we reached Maidenhead. We went through Maidenhead quickly, but after that we travelled along more slowly. We stopped for tea just before we got to Cookham. By the time we got through the lock it was evening. It was a bit windy, and someone had made a mistake because the wind was behind us. That does not usually happen. But that afternoon the wind actually helped us on our way, and the boat moved quite fast. There were no other people on the river, except for 3 old men. They were sitting in a boat, and they were fishing. As we got nearer, we could see that they were old. They were also quite serious, because they were watching their fishing lines very carefully. The sun was going down, and it threw a red light across the water. It was very beautiful, and we felt that we were sailing into some strange land. We did not sail into some strange land. We went straight into that boat with the 3 old men in it. At first we did not know what had happened, but then, from the words which rose on the evening air, we understood that we were near people. We also understood that those people were not happy. We had knocked those 3 old men from their seats, and they were all lying on the bottom of their boat. They were trying to stand up, and they were picking fish off themselves. As they worked, they shouted unkind things about us. Not just the usual things, but special things about us and about our families. Harris called out, "You ought to be pleased that something so exciting has happened to you." He added that he was very unhappy to hear men of their age use those bad words. But the 3 old men did not seem to agree with Harris. At Marlow, we left the boat near the bridge, and we went to spend the night in a hotel. Chapter 12. Montmorency and the Cat. On Monday morning, we got up quite early, and we went to swim before breakfast. On the way back, Montmorency behaved very stupidly. The only thing that Montmorency and I disagree about is cats. I like cats. Montmorency does not. When I meet a cat, I say hello to it. Then I bend down, and I stroke it gently, behind the ears and along the side of its head. The cat likes